Have you ever heard of something being Kafkaesque? Do you even know where the term comes from? Behind it is Franz Kafka, the only 20th century writer whose name is part of languages worldwide. Kafka died 100 years ago near Vienna. But to this day, millions of readers around the world are crazy about the dark author's enigmatic stories.
Once you catch Kafka fever, it's hard to get cured.
Kafka's texts deal with our deepest anxieties. Kafka saw himself as a failed author despite his super talent.
So what's this super talented writer all about? Who was Franz Kafka? Why is he still read so enthusiastically? And what exactly is Kafkaesque? An exhibition in Prague called Kafkaesque. A new video game that brings his literary world to life. Theater productions. On the 100th anniversary of Franz Kafka's death, we see the image of this tall, thin man with a hat and eyes full of astonished world-weariness everywhere. It's even trending on TikTok millions of times. Let's first look at who Franz Kafka was. Franz Kafka was born in Prague in 1883 to German-speaking Jewish parents. He's an excellent student, but constantly plagued by self-doubt. Am I good enough? Will everyone notice that I am actually completely incompetent? Maybe that's exactly why Franz chooses a down-to-earth profession after school. One that doesn't overwhelm him, an insurance employee. He goes through mountains of files and only lets the writer out at night. He writes stories, fragments of novels, and tons of letters and diaries. He also draws.
There are certain years or periods where we know almost day by day what he was doing. That we can, from distance, see the development of human being. His thoughts, his loves, his pain, his relationship with his father.
The relationship with his father, a painful chapter. In the eyes of Hermann Kafka, a successful businessman, Franz is never enough. One day, Franz writes a letter to his father, over 100 pages long, in which he finally wants to clear the air about their troubled relationship.
I, skinny, frail, fragile, you, strong, tall, thick-set. Even in the cubicle, I felt a puny wretch, and not only in front of you, but in front of the whole world, because for me, you were the measure of all things.
But Hermann Kafka never gets to see the letter, and things aren't going well with women either. He has many love affairs and is engaged twice, but as soon as things get serious, Franz Kafka gives up everything. No wonder he also doubts the value of his literature. Kafka's psyche was somewhat fragile, but unfortunately, so was his health. At just 40 years of age, he died of tuberculosis in 1924. His last will, written to his writer friend Max Brod, was that he should destroy all of his unpublished works. Fortunately for the world, he ignores this because he considers his friend Franz Kafka to be the greatest poet of his time. Today, Kafka's stories and novel fragments are world literature, and Kafka is one of the most widely read German-speaking authors in the world.
He would not have liked this. He would probably have said, guys, this is a huge misunderstanding. He didn't see himself as a successful writer. I mean, he tried to write a novel 3 times, and he never finished any of them. When Gregor Samsa woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed right there in his bed into some sort of monstrous insect.
This is how Kafka's most famous story, The Metamorphosis, published in 1915, starts. A young man who wakes up as an insect. Sounds strange, but apparently it still triggers many people today. A symbol of feeling at the mercy of others.
incredibly well captures what it feels like to be misunderstood or feel misunderstood as a young person. You know, the familial stresses, the pressures of starting out in the world in a profession where you're just very sure that you are going to fail. And look at that, here you are failing, despite your great effort and, intentions. And I think it resonates a lot with young people.
Susan Bernofsky has translated the Metamorphosis into English. She teaches at New York's Columbia University and repeatedly experiences a Kafka mania among her students.
Every time I bring a Kafka text into my classroom, the students go crazy for it. Usually it's me, hey, look at this first sentence, and then letting Kafka take it from there.
Being lost, not fitting in, not knowing the rules, not reaching your goal. This feeling runs through all of Kafka's works. The castle. Kay, the hero of this story, receives a job as a surveyor from the count of a castle. But Kay will never get there, and the residents of the neighboring village cannot help him either. Man versus bureaucracy. Typical Kafka. The judgment. The story of a father-son conflict. Many have read it as autobiographical. Kafka's reaction to this, I'm not sure of that either. The trial. Yosef K. is arrested and doesn't even know why. It's a surreal situation. Yosef K. is drawn into a nightmarish labyrinth without knowing the reason for the accusation or whether there will even be a verdict.
He is constantly receiving information, but he cannot assess how reliable it is. And the information appears contradictory, and the information constantly raises new questions. That's the crazy thing. Every time he gets an answer, it immediately raises a new question, and then he has to try to research this. And of course, he never comes to an end.
Disinformation through too much information. That's so Kafka. Bizarre, tragic, and also a bit funny. All of these texts are over 100 years old and read as if they had only just been written, so totally current.
I think Kafka is still so relevant 100 years after his death because the world that Kafka writes about is still our world in some way. The problems, bureaucracy, totalitarianism, the relationship of people to orders that they cannot understand very well, be they political or legal or even religious, these are all the same as today.
Siguen siendo básicamente los mismos problemas que nos ocupan actualmente.
What Kafka also noticed very early on, as something which is a kind of threat, is that we are flooded with information. But the information no longer forms a meaningful whole. You can, if you want, research on the internet from morning to evening, but the crucial questions are not answered in this way.
No orientation, feeling lost. Perhaps Kafka's stories are so universal because they're detached from a time and place.
We don't know where the story happens, when it happens. He's not using the full names, but just initials. There's not exact time presented in his text. So it's an ideal work for every period.
Not even the places we're talking about have a name.
This is precisely why Kafka works worldwide. There are art festivals and exhibitions in Thailand, New York, and now in Prague that translate his surreal worlds into images. Is showing the exhibition Kafkaesque, with works by over 30 international artists who resonate deeply with Kafka's themes, even in contemporary times.
One of the artists at this exhibition told us that he could sign a letter to father with his name, and he would not change any sentence in the text.
And then the language. Kafka writes clearly and simply, objectively. There's nothing artificial or convoluted, but what he describes is dreamlike and nebulous.
He pulls out all the stops, and I just, as a young person, was so just blown away by his way of creating these situations and using language to describe things so precisely in a way that, despite all the precision, you have no idea what's going on.
It's these spaces that Kafka creates that become smaller and smaller or larger and larger, or, as he often describes, the impossibility of getting from one point to another. Kafka manages to describe, in very clear words, the images that we encounter in our nightmares.
These images, the surreal moods, became a huge source of inspiration for writers all over the world. Haruki Murakami, Samuel Beckett, Philip Roth, Paul Celan, Paul Auster, they were all fascinated by the interplay between everyday life and the fantastic. And perhaps the great Gabriel Garcia Marquez only found his voice through Kafka.
When he read Kafka, he thought, that's how I write. That's how my grandmother spoke. As a child, his grandmother always told him about witches and people who flew. So I can write like that too, in a very natural way, without arguing, without explaining anything, and that comes directly from what magical realism is. What is known as magical realism in South America goes back to a large extent to Kafka.
But Kafka's eerie moods don't just provide inspiration for writers. Hollywood director Orson Welles filmed Kafka's trial, dark, expressionistic.
To be in chains is sometimes safer than to be free.
Filmmaker and painter David Lynch may not make Kafka films, but in his works he creates Kafkaesque worlds in which the boundaries between realism and fantasy are blurred. In his movie Mulholland Drive, he leaves the viewer alone in the attempt to understand something.
It's been a very strange day.
Getting stranger.
You very often don't know what's going on, what's happening. It's very confusing for the viewer, as well as Kafka's text might be confusing for the reader. David Lynch met with Kafka's writing very early, already at the end of the 60s, when he made his first experimental films. He even said that he feels that Kafka is his spiritual brother. And he even wrote the script for a film based by Kafka's Metamorphosis.
The exhibition in Prague Stock Center attempts to explore this feeling in a Kafkaesque way. Artists who show that Kafka is understood everywhere, in Israel, in England, and in China. For example, in the works of Liu Xia.
For many of the Chinese dissidents, the reality of their everyday life under the communist regime was very close to those kind of socio-political qualities of Kafka's writings. She felt Kafkaesque.
Well, here we are again, Kafkaesque. It exists in almost every language. It's also in many dictionaries. Is there an official definition of what Kafkaesque means? A question we ask our experts.
It's used to describe especially bureaucratic situations that don't quite make sense and seem unreasonable and seem to have been dictated by a higher power to which one has no access.
If you get into some bizarre situation on everyday basis,
Kafkiano in Spanish, Kafkaesque, is used very similarly as in other parts of the world to talk about something a little dark, macabre, incomprehensible, overwhelming. An absurd situation created by absurd rules.
Yes, I know that feeling. We all know it. The helplessness in a world that is becoming increasingly complex. Will we still know the word in 100 years? Kafkaesque? Most likely, yes. Because what Kafka describes is something deeply human, and that will remain. Do you know Franz Kafka? What's your favorite book by this author? Tell us in the comments.